Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, the backdrop to all of this is a sense of national frustration to which MPs want to respond. That's perhaps why we're in hung parliament territory at all. And when we look at what makes people frustrated, it's perhaps the fact that living standards are stagnant. In short, Britain is tired of austerity and wants a pay rise. And that's not surprising given the long squeeze on wages we've been living through. We'll hear what the Bank of England says about that shortly. But first, our business editor, Helen Thomas, sets out what we know and don't about pay.
Sometimes it feels like everything in the world of work is speeding up. The mantra is do more, and more quickly. But one thing is stuck on go slow, and that, unfortunately, is wages.
The public sector pay cap is hitting recruitment and retention right across the public sector.
It's been a week of political wrangling over whether the cap on public sector pay rises should be lifted. But this isn't just the public sector. This is about the whole economy. Here's real wage growth, pay rises adjusted for inflation. It slumped after the financial crisis. Very low inflation meant a better time around 2015. Then, the vote to leave the EU. Inflation rose sharply. Living standards are again in decline.
But inflation isn't really the nub of this problem. The bigger puzzle is why workers aren't managing to push for a pay rise despite very low levels of unemployment. Now, economic theory would tell us that low unemployment puts workers in a stronger position. Employers find it hard to fill vacancies. And yet UK unemployment is at 4.6%, the lowest level since the 1970s. But wage growth is sluggish. In fact, it's worse than sluggish. Recently, it's been heading in the wrong direction.
So why has this relationship broken down? The crisis spooked workers and their employers. Now Brexit is churning the corporate waters. If workers are reluctant to move jobs, they miss out on one way to get a hefty rise.
On the other side, you have employers that also have the uncertainty of demand and uncertainty over the potential increases in costs, given the exchange rate falling, that are likely to hold on to wage demands a bit more and be a bit more careful.
Next up, another economic headache. Productivity growth has been nearly as disappointing as earnings. This is one measure, output per hour worked. Expansion helped living standards for decades. Then it flatlined, and no one is entirely sure why. Everyone agrees that dismal pay and dismal productivity are linked. But which causes the other? Well, it isn't that simple.
Well, productivity is obviously key in the long term to how much we can pay ourselves, what the wages are that people receive, because in the end, what we produce as a country does determine how much we can pay ourselves. But the relationship between pay and productivity is more complicated than that, and actually it's two ways. So sometimes what we see is when pay increases, firms respond to that by investing in machines, investing in upskilling their workforce, and that actually leads to higher productivity. So it's not just that higher productivity can lead to higher pay, it's that higher pay can lead to higher productivity.
Perhaps other changes mean that the headline unemployment rate just doesn't really reflect what's going on. This is co-working. In this WeWork office, freelancers or entrepreneurs can join up by the month, a space to work with craft beer, yoga classes and events laid on. Self-employment has risen, nearly doubling its share of the workforce since 1980. But so has part-time working, temporary work and 0 hours contracts. This includes the so-called gig economy, types of jobs which offer no guaranteed hours, little career progression or job security. It means an employer could offer more hours instead of a pay rise or a better contract. So what hope is there that wages get moving again?
Well, that is the question for the British labour market and actually for the British economy and British families over the next few years. There's some things we definitely know for certain. Wages at the bottom of the labour market because of a fast rising national minimum wage, those are going to be going up significantly over the next few years. The big unknown is what happens to the rest of the workforce, the top 80% of workers who aren't affected by the minimum wage. Those people are currently seeing big squeezes on their pay packets. What happens to them does depend on, does Brexit scare firms, or do they think there's big opportunities out there and they start to get their confidence back? And do workers get their confidence back?
Wage tension hasn't just vanished, of course not. But the lower unemployment gets without wages rising, the more likely that longer-term, tougher-to-fix factors are standing between British workers and their pay rise.
Helen Thomas. Well, earlier today, I sat down at the Bank of England with the chief economist there, Andy Haldane. He's been in the news lately, having given a speech that suggested he might vote for an interest rate rise later this year. Didn't want to say anything more about rates today, but he was quite keen to talk about pay and why he thinks it's flatlined for the better part of a decade.
What have been the drivers? There's no single factor, but I'd say among the most important has been the fact that at the same time as real take-home pay has flatlined, so too has the measured productive capacity of the economy. You know, typically you expect that as that productive capacity builds up and grows over time, that gets mirrored in pay increases. So if we're looking for one of, if not the biggest contributing cause, it is the accompanying flatlining of just not just the UK's, but many other economies' productive capacity over the last 10 years or so.
And that has been extraordinary, because we tend to think we just get a little bit better at everything. People will ask, what is going on there? Have we run out of innovation?
This is not a story about stagnating innovation in the main. So when we talk about, I don't know, the rise of the robots, the fourth industrial revolution, it's there, but only for a subset of firms, only for that 1% or perhaps 5% of firms who are taking the productivity high road. The root cause of the stagnation in productivity and in pay is that long, lower tail of firms. They're taking the low productivity road.
It's like 95% of them.
It's a sizable chunk. Right. It's at least at 3/4 and perhaps more.
And what they're doing is they're just employing more cheap labour, squeezing the labour very hard, but not really equipping it in the best ways or innovating or thinking of new things to be doing and new products to sell, correct? So
quite so. I mean,
and then they can't afford to pay more because they haven't got more revenue, really.
This long tail, and to be clear, this is not just a crisis phenomenon. If you look at those companies, that long tail, they've been with us perhaps for a couple of decades, actually. Every country on the planet appears to have that long tail of firms. It just appears to be somewhat longer in the UK than elsewhere. And there are companies, as you say, that are perhaps not investing sufficiently in the skills of their workers, perhaps not investing sufficiently in machines and automation.
So it's not the champions we need to worry about, it's the kind of mediocre.
I think this is
mediocre
arithmetically, that would do a lot more. I mean, there's a natural temptation to gravitate towards the new and the shiny. Let's seed the next Tesla or Google or Apple. I am saying to you, arithmetically, in terms of boosting the numbers, you'd probably get a lot more purchase out of incremental improvements from that long tail of companies.
Let's talk about public sector wages. There's a huge debate over public sector pay. It's been going up at 1% a year for the last 5 years or so.
Well, that plainly does factor very significantly in our deliberations when figuring out how great are underlying inflationary pressures in the economy. You know, we have been repeatedly surprised about how weak pay growth has been, not just in the public sector, but in the private sector as well. And if anything, pay growth over the past 12 months has been falling rather than picking up, which has taken us and indeed the rest of the world somewhat by surprise, given that over that same period, jobs growth has remained very buoyant. Unemployment's kept on a falling. So this weighs with us. Of course, it's a factor that has contributed to rates in the UK remaining at their currently very low levels, and watching closely for any signs of pay picking up. That's one of the key indicators we look at when judging the stats.
Right, and just to be clear, the public sector pay matters in that. It's not just the private sector.
Absolutely.
So, now I know that you don't particularly want to step on the interest rate landmine at this point, but it would be interesting, I think, for people to think about where they might be in 5 or 10 years' time. If people are buying a house or thinking about mortgages, the long-term average on the bank website, it goes back 300 years, it's 5%. So that gives you a guide to the sort of the long-term norm.
Yeah.
What would you advise people to plan on? I mean, to think of rates at the sort of 5% level or the 0.5% level? It's quite a big, it's quite a big span, isn't it?
Well, I mean, you're right in pointing out that rates currently, and if you believe financial markets prospectively, are set to remain pretty low for a pretty long time. I mean, not just the lowest in the last 300 years, possibly the lowest in the last several thousand years, I would say. As and when rates begin to rise in the UK, they are likely to do so in a gradual way and to a limited extent, by which we mean the numbers that may have been in people's heads from the past are probably on the high side relative to what we might expect in the future. Let me not put a number on that.
I won't squeeze you on numbers.
But limited and gradual is the name of the game.
Andrew Haldane, thank you very much.
Thank you, Evan.